going to begin our third session of today, and I'm the moderator for this session. So I will introduce each speaker, as they, right before they speak. The first speaker is Anooradha Iyer Siddiqi, whose paper is Ecologies and Aesthetics of Dissent, Constructing Mediatic Environments of Resistance in Sri Lanka. Anooradha is a professor of architecture at Barnard College, at Columbia University. Her book, Architecture of Migration, the Dadaab Refugee Camps and Humanitarian Settlement, is forthcoming from Duke University Press in December, I believe, just in time for Christmas shopping. Okay. And Anooradha works on various, she has wide-ranging research interests, including work on architecture in Sri Lanka that she'll be speaking about today. So the floor is yours.
Sound is good? Yeah, good. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I was saying I'll show you lots of pretty pictures so you don't fall asleep after lunch. Okay, so thanks so much to all the organizers and for everyone for being here. It's really, really so nice to be here. My talk today is a first attempt to gather thoughts around a larger project called Ecologies and Aesthetics of Dissent, in which I'm examining long-standing and articulated collective and visual and spatial practices by artists, architects, environmental activists, media practitioners. Together, these all provide a pedagogy on ecofeminism and aesthetics of dissent. I foreground practices that have sustained collective forms of dissent through methods and works that convert the ideational and symbolic into the distinctly palpable and sensible. These practices have struggled against degradations and harm to the living and constructed environment, providing a pedagogy for caregiving and cohabitation within it. And they're located in Sri Lanka, India, Kenya, and some foster pan-South Asian, pan-African, or Indian Ocean alliances. I began by studying the Mazingira Institute, Mazingira meaning environment in Kiswahili. It's a decades-long research and activist practice by two architects and systems theory practitioners, Davinder Lamba, a member of Kenya's South Asian community, and Diana Lee Smith, a UK national who refused to repatriate after Kenyan independence. They began their careers in the 1960s teaching in the Faculty of Architecture in the University of Nairobi, the East African Regional Center for the Study of Architecture from the colonial period to the present. And they were expelled for acts of dissent, along with their colleague Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who attempted to abolish his unit, the Department of English, in favor of a Department of African Literature and Languages. These actions and others eventually led to detentions, arrests, imprisonments. We know very well of Ngugi's, but Davinder Lamba experienced similar formal oppression. Over the years, the Mazingira Institute has produced studies and community practices and projects on foodways and public transportation, particularly the Nairobi Matatu system, which you see in this image on the left. This is the kind of semi-public, formal, informal minibus transportation system. They produce literature and materials on development, such as a primer on cattle raising for pastoralist children, studies on women's development for the UN, the World Bank, and women's networks. They produced environmental studies on reforestation convergent with the establishment of UN habitat in Nairobi. And they served as the ground for the issue-based Indian Ocean Network, which was intended to grow an educated public. And you see here in their publication on rising sea levels and other issues in this newsletter from the early 1990s. The infrastructural, urban, architectural, and explicitly environmental work of the Mazingira Institute is one among multiple practices. I've been examining. Each of them diverge in orientation and method. All have a strong politics, although not all imagine their immediate work falling within categories of dissent, ecology, or aesthetics, as the Mazingira Institute does. So my reliance on these terms is interpretive. I use them to imagine a field created by practices. And theorizing this way is a critical ecofeminist analytical strategy that enables us to constitute integrated material, social, and intellectual homes, which are formative for constructing resistance to oppression and caring for our places on the planet. Today, I am gathering artistic and media practices for a leg of this work titled Feminist Mediatic Environments. And in today's paper, Constructing Mediatic Environments of Resistance in Sri Lanka, I use the term mediatic environments to describe a field of social and environmental response and caregiving. It serves as an analytic for a series of forces I see having emerged in Sri Lanka during the concurrent oppressions of the Civil War and the implementation of the Free Trade Zone, beginning in the late 70s and early 1980s. Both created untenable daily conditions and a larger period of crisis within which a feminist social environment emerged through a series of intentional as well as indirect practices using diverse forms of media within articulated institutional channels. So my historical instinct is that these activities created an ecosystem in every sense of the word, and I welcome your feedback on how to develop this beyond my aim today, which is to situate works and activities by two collaborative practices. One is Women and Media Collective, and the other is Raking Leaves, in a mapping of long-standing visual and spatial practices based in Sri Lanka, but like all things based in Sri Lanka, operating within critical global and regional valences. Neither of these two practices, sorry, let me go back for a minute. Neither of these two practices categorically articulates its work in terms of the ecological, yet each struggles against degradations and harm to the living and constructed environment by providing a pedagogy for caregiving and cohabitation within it. If they diverge from one another in orientation and method, each of these practices shares a sensibility for politics and the political. And my paper is based on research in rarely accessed archives, interviews with principals in these practices, namely Kumudini Samuel and Sepali Kottakoda of Women and Media Collective, Nelufer de Mel, the editor of their English language journal, as well as Sharmini Pereira, who is the founder of Raking Leaves. And again, this work contributes to a larger ecology of enduring collective visual and spatial practices that I'm attempting to identify by artists and architects and media practitioners whose work has alloyed South Asian, African, and Indian Ocean ecologies and aesthetics of descent. So, it's a paper that grew out of years of research on a project called Ecologies of the Past, which in part examines the critical heritage practices of Sri Lankan architect Minette de Silva. She developed a mediatic approach to the archive, employing the tools of large format portfolio publication availed by architects worldwide, and especially in Sri Lanka's global travel and tourism industry, in a pictorial memoir titled The Life and Work of an Asian Woman Architect. In this memoir, it's possible to learn of her own ecological preservation and landscape design practices. This image shows some of my horticultural research into her adaptation of seeds, soils, plants from the Royal Botanical Gardens at Peradeniya near Kandy, a significant breeding site within the Kew Gardens network. De Silva developed a coding related to native and colonial planting in designing and crafting landscape architecture, braiding together ecologies of multiple pasts into critical narratives of heritage. She's part of an early generation constructing the feminist environments I'm concerned with. Her book is part family album, part Bildungsroman, and part architectural portfolio. And her work on this publication in the 1990s until her passing in 1998 was encouraged by Women and Media Collective, who published an interview with her and included her in a calendar of significant Sri Lankan women. Yet more than these direct connections, I want to suggest that her project to publish her archives in this manner built on their interventions and construction of a mediatic environment over the course of that decade and the previous one. Women and Media Collective emerged from the efforts of Sunela Abisekara, who worked in theater and also with writers and feminist collectives in the early 1980s, concerned with the representation of women, as well as Kumudini Samuel, who worked with the labor movement, organizing strikes in the free trade zone and successfully striking against Polytex garments for over a month. Together, they formed the Women's Action Committee in 1983. As we know, 1983 also brought the anti-Tamil pogrom, now memorialized as Black July, which is broadly understood as a set of events that precipitated the war between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE. Many in the Women's Action Committee and the wider leftist networks fled Sri Lanka or were killed at the time. Without getting into the finer points of Sri Lankan political history, it would be important to note that Kumudini Samuel has remarked that Women and Media Collective was never associated with the JVP, or the JVP is the People's Liberation Front. I'll talk about them in a minute. She says that in the 1980s, many women went to meetings organized by leftist entities, but were very conscious of women's issues and often started autonomous women's groups. She and Sunela were interested in finding political solutions to problems framed in terms of ethno-nationalisms, and were working at the local level where small actions were required, with people in the plantations, labor in the free trade zone, students, others struggling against the water tax, for equal wages, for example, for women plantation workers. So in 1984, both Abisekara and Samuel started producing material, effectively founding Women and Media Collective, beginning with a translation into Sinhala of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa's pamphlet, Housework as Work, and as well as a small visual history of feminist thinking called A Potted History of Feminism. It had cartoons and illustration, was also translated into Sinhala. A flurry of print projects followed, leaflets to commemorate International Women's Day, May Day, announcing the movement Women for Peace. They were printed through letterpress and later lithopress. And in 1985, typing on stencil and printing through cyclostyle, they published a newsletter called Media Monitor, tracking media portrayals of women. In the violence and government-ordered disappearances of the years between 1987 and 1990, and the violence of the counterinsurgency uprising led by the JVP and eventually the LTTE, widespread fear led to the foreclosure of and disillusionment with leftist politics. That and the occupation of 98% of the leadership positions in the trade unions in the free trade zone by men broadly impacted feminist movements. Kumudini Samuel also recalled that one could not risk discussing politics in public or even carrying newspapers. Mobilizing her gendered position, she would transport news clippings in the bottom of a grocery bag piled with vegetables. Women and Media Collective created literature clandestinely. In 1988, they began the Shilpini project using an in-house printing press to teach women letterpress skills and run screen printing workshops, silk screening posters for NGOs. This project employed a group of women through Abisekara and Samuel's salaries from other employment and trained members of diverse women's groups. The group committed to trilingual publication. They had 3 magazines for 3 different readerships, focusing on feminist politics with particular audiences in mind. The Sinhala magazine Iyer, which means she, reaching out to a majority population. The English Options, linked to international audiences in South Asia and beyond, and always featuring Sri Lankan women artists on the covers. And Soul, building on Tamil creative writing groups founded during the war. Each of these 3 instruments developed messaging and also created salons and spaces, physical spaces, particularly for Sinhala and Tamil groups, in each context examining and critiquing the representation of women in media, thinking through cultural politics, and valorizing mediatic expression by women. Women in Media Collective raised a range of issues around sexuality, identity, feminism, and politics against the backdrop of an armed conflict that militarized women and gendered subjects of war in diverse ways. Women in Media Collective's campaigns for birth control and abortion rights in the free trade zone, where these rights had been disallowed, protested against media representation of dislocated young women with little familial support being the best at factory work, hastening their economic risk and often sexual oppression. There's much to say about Women in Media Collective, but I'll leave it here, historically situating this group within a larger trajectory of practices of dissent. I argue that Women and Media Collective created an ecology of feminist practices of advocacy, care, and dissent tethered together, intended to name and articulate the mediatic environment while also revolutionizing it. Raking Leaves indicates another generation in this conceptual tradition, rooted in the curatorial practice of Sharmini Pereira, whose early career was spent in publishing, working under Ivana Blazwick at Phaidon, as well as Robert Violet at Violet Editions on books on Joseph Beuys and James Turrell, the noted artists. She was invited to co-curate the Singapore Biennial in 2006, and in looking after artists from South Asia, began to consider commissioning artworks that would take the form of the book, leaning into, as she put it, an inevitability about the codex. The Raking Leaves book series has included emerging and celebrated artists from the Tamil, Muslim, and Sinhala communities of Sri Lanka, and international teams of designers, editors, and translators. The first project that I'm going to show, published in 2011, has been exhibited internationally, The Incomplete Tombu, it's called, by Jaffna artist Shanadanan, designer Nia Murphy, and curator Sharmini Pereira, in collaboration, interprets the bureaucratic file of the land register, the tombu, or the tome, another word for book, through a collection of drawings made by displaced people remembering or inventing the floor plans of their lost homes. The orthodoxy of architectural rendering and its imagination of an edifice counters the draftsman's tracings on mock vellum papers, a set of floor plans drawn from trauma, searing into one's understanding the impossibility of these hand drawings existing as anything other than fictional accounts. According to Pereira, Raking Leaves instigated a collaborative practice of producing exhibitions in the form of a commonplace book, with relatively large publication runs of 2,500 to 3,500. Ed Ruscha, the artist Ed Ruscha, for example, would publish a few hundred or 1,000 art books at a time. Raking Leaves aimed not to publish in excess, but instead to ensure that each project resulted from a careful curatorial process, including the artists, designers, and printers. Each project included a special edition of artist proofs for collectors, and the books would be placed in institutions that collect artist books. This executed a paradoxical process, on the one hand, commissioning new work by artists based in parts of the world that could not depend on any system of galleries and museums, and on the other, depending quite squarely on the international art market, such that these art books would be sold in bookshops of museums, even if the artists themselves were not present in the museum's collection or exhibition programs. Pereira notes that, ironically, Raking Leaves books have found their way into certain important museum collections, many to which she did not have access as a curator, or which might not otherwise have enabled the curation of the artists she sought. And few artists in South Asia utilize the artist book as a primary medium, despite the long history of illuminated manuscripts and the more recent history of artist books in this part of the world. Speaking of knowledge bases within South Asia. Notably, this part of the world was marked in 1981 by the organized arson of the Jaffna Public Library, destroying the tens of thousands of volumes, including ancient Tamil manuscripts, in one of Asia's largest repositories. Against this backdrop, the Raking Leaves Codex operates in profoundly affective registers, taking on a heightened poetic and symbolic value. As the Raking Leaves series comes to an end, it's important to narrate that its most recent work, a trilingual project called The A to Z of Conflict, was printed outside Sri Lanka and then detained at the port, where authorities disallowed the shipment's entry for several months. As its promotional text relates, it imagines what a commonplace children's ABC book would look like if all the entries were chosen in relation to words about conflict and words born out of conflict. Each copy of the A to Z of Conflict is bound in one of 6 combinations, reflecting how 3 languages can be positioned without giving one language greater status over the other. Drawing on the history of language conflict in Sri Lanka, this artist's book serves as a collective means to think about how language rights, exclusion, status, and planning might serve us better in the future than they have in the past. I include on the screen an indication of the complexity of the process that Pereira has described, and she mentions this entry in the Tamil section under the letter Nu with the word nulakam, accompanied by a dry pastel on paper drawing of a single match stick intended to evoke the arson of the Jaffna Library. So I want to just close on that problem of border crossing and the conceptualization of an environment that the movement of the leaves generated and that their hindrance illuminates. Pereira's conceptualization of Raking Leaves drew on the 1993 work of Canadian artist Jeff Wall, A Sudden Gust of Wind After Hokusai, a large color photograph displayed in a light box. The work is based on the circa 1832 woodcut by Japanese painter and printmaker Hokusai called Travelers Caught in a Sudden Breeze at Ejiri. As a student at the Royal College of Art, Pereira studied the Edo period, examining the mass production of woodblock prints used to wrap porcelain, which was the vehicle by which Gauguin, Matisse, and other impressionists came to see the world. The play of leaves blowing in the wind and leaves of paper, both in Wall's image and Hokusai's original, produced for her the suggestion of the slow release of ideas into the world, that something from elsewhere had entered into these prints, the concept that the leaves, or the folios, if you wish, move and could be gathered. In this ecological metaphor, I think we can locate Raking Leaves within the conceptual terrain in which Women in Media collectives and Minette de Silva's artifacts serve as anchor points. So I want to end by underscoring that my articulation of feminist mediatic environments should be understood as constituting intellectual inhabitations and ecologies of material inhabitation during an articulated time of war and economic extractivism, anchored in local environments, but always attracting imperial interest and powers seeking to operate on a global scale. What stakes this ecology possesses and how those stakes were and are negotiated is the story of practice I wish to excavate as the project continues. I see those negotiations and the construction of those mediatic environments of resistance filled equally with purpose and chance. Thank you.